The W13 was bouncing more than ever in Baku. The drivers are asked in every interview about it and their answers are always the same. It's incredibly painful and we want the FIA to help. But why don't Mercedes just solve the problem if it's hurting their drivers that much? Let's check out why. The Azerbaijan Grand Prix was Mercedes' best race since the opening weekend of the season in Bahrain. Just like in Bahrain, it was another team's failures that gave Mercedes a podium and 4th place finish. This time though, it wasn't Red Bull, it was Ferrari whose cars had a complete implosion. First, Carlos Sainz on lap 8 and then Charles Leclerc on lap 21 saw their cars completely give up on them. Before the race, George Russell had said that the best they could manage was 5th position unless something went wrong ahead of them. Luckily for George, it did, and he managed to pick up a 3rd podium of the season at Ferrari's expense and continue his run of top 5 finishes. However, George and Lewis might have been hoping for their cars to break down like the Ferraris at some point this race. The level of porpoising that Mercedes was suffering was as bad as anything we've seen so far. I was just holding and biting down on my teeth due to the pain, and the adrenaline helped, Hamilton told Sky F1. I cannot express the pain that you experience, particularly on the straight here. At the end, you're just praying for it to end. George Russell was having just as bad a day as Hamilton. I was pretty pleased the race came to a close. We were just smashing the ground every single corner. Every lap for an hour and a half is pretty brutal, so I'll sleep well tonight, Russell told Sky F1. Especially on a circuit that's not normally that physical. I'm pleased to be standing on the podium. As a team, we've got to be there to pick up the pieces at the end. And that is what we're doing. We have just got to deal with it, and as drivers, accept that there's not going to be any short-term changes. But there are conversations going on about the long-term future of these regulations. Let's see. We've got intelligent people in this sport, so I'm sure we'll find a solution. This is a conversation that has been had with the Mercedes drivers for a few races now. George especially has spoken of conversations going on and them being in pain from the bouncing and being worried about health and safety. They have every right to be worried about health and safety. That level of bouncing must be incredibly distracting. There was a moment at turn 18 where Hamilton nearly lost control of his car because of the bouncing, which would have resulted in an incredibly high-speed crash. The risk of micro-concussions is very real as well. On his near crash, Hamilton said, "There were a lot of moments where I didn't know if I was going to make it, whether I was going to keep the car on the track. As on the high speed, I nearly lost it several times," he said. The battle with the car was intense. The thing was bouncing so much, there were so many times I was nearly going into the wall. That was a concern safety-wise. There is a safety concern about bashing into a wall at 180 miles an hour, and I don't think I've ever had to think about that too much as a racing driver. It's a very strange experience. But who should they be having the conversations with? At the moment, the Mercedes team seem pretty insistent on having them with Formula One management and the FIA. The complaining to the FIA over the regulations hasn't sat right with a lot of people. Everyone can see that the Mercedes car is by far the worst sufferer of the effect. They've won the Constructors' Championship 8 years in a row. If there are teams at the back of the grid that can solve the problem, surely Mercedes have someone on their team who's smart enough to come up with a solution. Of course they do, and that's why this has started to quickly become a bit of a controversy. Some teams have done a great job of alleviating the issue. Red Bull, for example, aren't really affected at all by the problem. They have come up with a design that has eliminated it without reducing porpoising. Mercedes seem unable to come up with a solution that won't limit their performance. Hence why they're now complaining to the FIA instead of getting things changed. Lando Norris said after the race in Baku, "We have some porpoising, some bouncing, but it is what you have to deal with. It's a trade of trying to gain performance, and we can quite easily go lower and gain more performance but have more porpoising. But we just think where we are at the moment is the correct amount. I'm sure the Mercedes could have a much stiffer floor and raise the ride height, and it would be much nicer for them, but they obviously just don't want to lose the performance. So, I don't think it is anything to complain about. People just need to find ways of fixing it themselves." Like Lando says, the easiest way for Mercedes to solve this problem is to raise their ride height. But doing so will reduce the car's performance significantly, which is obviously bad for their competitiveness. Do you want to know what else is bad for Mercedes' competitiveness? Having to use a stand-in driver because George Russell or Lewis Hamilton are too badly hurt to drive. At the moment, Mercedes are risking the long-term health of both of their drivers because they don't want to sacrifice their performance. George Russell has said multiple times that he thinks that porpoising will end in someone having a really bad crash because they lose control of the car. Hamilton nearly had that crash in Baku. When this does happen, it will be Mercedes' fault because they chose not to sacrifice performance for safety. After the race, Hamilton looked to be in agony walking away from his W13. Not everyone was quite so convinced though. Dutch F1 presenter Olav Mol said he sees that camera and then he starts walking with his hand on his back. He wants everyone to see that. They want the FIA to change something because they say it's too dangerous. I think that's total nonsense. He's going to shout that it's so dangerous, but I don't trust it for a second. He wants someone else to solve it. Christian Horner was asked what he'd tell his drivers to say if the RB18 was bouncing as much as a W13. He said, "I tell them to bitch as much as they could on the radio and make as big an issue out of it as they possibly could. It's part of the game." Asked then whether he thought that's what some of the teams were indeed doing, he said, "Of course it is. I mean, look, you can see it's uncomfortable, but there are remedies to that. But it's to the detriment of the car performance. What's the easiest thing to do is to complain from a safety point of view, but each team has a choice." Horner continued, "I think if it was a genuine safety concern across the whole grid, then it's something that should be looked at. But it's only affecting isolated people or teams. That's something that the team should potentially deal with. This is a big stumbling block for Mercedes. They aren't the only team on the grid that's bouncing, but there are definitely those that aren't. Teams like Red Bull have built in solutions to porpoising into their design. Those solutions may be negatively impacting their performance. If you let Mercedes add something like active suspension to their car to solve the problem, then you potentially give them a huge advantage as their car won't have these porpoising solutions built in." Horner addresses this as well. "The easiest thing is obvious to raise a car." So, the team has a choice to do that, Horner said. You have a choice where you run your car, don't you? And you should never run a car that's unsafe. But I think that's more for the technical guys, because there's certain cars that have issues and there are some cars that have few issues. It would seem unfair to penalise the ones that have done a decent job versus the ones that have perhaps missed the target slightly. Over the weekend, some information came out that means that no matter how loudly the Mercedes team complains about porpoising, there won't be any changes made. During discussions about the progress of the 2022 cars, a proposal was put forward to counter concerns about the risk of porpoising. It is understood that as it became clear how low teams were going to have to run the 2022 generation of cars, the idea of introducing something to eradicate the risk of bouncing was discussed. But the proposal, believed to involve a series of technical measurements that would have effectively mandated a minimum ride height to lift the cars clear from being at risk of porpoising, did not have the necessary support, so was binned. If teams rejected a change before the season, why would they be interested in one now? The teams that worked hard to solve the problem will have spent money from their $141.2 million budget cap to do so. They don't want that development budget to have been wasted. And that's another advantage that Mercedes will gain from any change. They haven't spent the money to find a solution. Whether Toto Wolff and co like it or not, they have to make changes to how they're setting up their car, or spend money on aerodynamic and mechanical solutions, because this is their problem. George and Lewis need to be calling for the Mercedes team to change the car if they're worried about their health, not the FIA. Mercedes are in complete control of the porpoising, and if they don't choose to sacrifice performance to solve it, then they'll be responsible for whatever happens to their drivers. Let's hope they choose their drivers' health and safety over a few tenths of a second of lap time. Want to know more about what's going on in F1? Then click the video showing on your screen and I'll see you there.